please join me in welcoming Michael Brooks to Lafayette.
Hi. It's really good to be here. Can everybody hear me without a mic?
Yeah.
All right. I've only seen this in the movies, but I feel like I'm gonna lean on the board and get the chalk all over my jacket. Does that actually happen, Professor?
They just clean the board.
All right, so I'm okay. So I'll keep these opening remarks relatively brief because I think it's always more interesting and fun if we can actually talk to and engage with each other. Unless you're calling into my show, in which case I keep the calls tight. So I want to hit on three themes. I'll talk a little bit about myself and how I came to be where I am. Briefly, it might be interesting. What this book is about and how it fits into the larger project. And I guess I will make a few-minute case for the candidate that I strongly prefer in this election cycle. So I have a pretty unusual background in some ways, which I guess is appropriate for unusual times. My parents were hippies, and they left New York when I was very little. They were totally broke, to be honest, and we sort of fled to Massachusetts in the kind of middle of nowhere, and or felt like the middle of nowhere. It's not actual middle of nowhere, but that's what I thought as a little kid. Like, can I swear?
Sure.
Like, why the fuck are we leaving New York? This is so boring. And they were very influenced by the counterculture. And I was homeschooled, and it was very self-directed. So I won't get too much into that. I think there's advantages and disadvantages to going that route. But one advantage I did have was I was able to do a lot of reading and a lot of very self-directed reading in any area that interested me. And I happen to be very particularly interested in, when I was middle school, teenage age, I got very entranced with politics, specifically movements in the 60s around civil rights and how they connected to global rights. And that led to my interest in international relations, Latin America, and so on. I ended up going to Bates College and studied international relations, and I spent time in the Middle East and studied in Turkey and studied the relationship between the European Union and Turkey. And then I worked in brand strategy and taught meditation for a minute to try to make my parents happy, and was unemployed because this was after 2008 financial crash. And I ended up getting a job as a producer on a show called The Majority Report, which when I started, I thought honestly I would do for a year and then I would bag it and go to graduate school. And then I started subbing on the show and hosting, and I realized this is what I'd like to do. I never thought I could do it. I never thought there was any path to making a living in media, let alone in television hosting. I didn't have the resources to go do a bunch of summer internships. I didn't even know how one did this. You know, I'd look at like Chris Matthews on TV and I'd be like, where did this come from? How does one do this? You sit around, Capitol Hill and beg people for internships, and I guess a couple decades later, you're literally perched on TV talking nonsense. A lot of opinions. So I launched my own show a couple of years ago, and I focus a lot on international affairs. And I definitely would call myself and am a democratic socialist, which is a trendy term now. And we try to actually bridge that with some very, very important kind of Marxist frame for understanding the world. It's an interesting dynamic because I think these ideas are really important and the moment is super opportune, and at the same time I also, I want us to be what we call sometimes the pre-mainstream, right? I don't want to be in the margins. I want us to win. I think we have the best program. So I'm not interested in being on the outside protesting. That's important. But I want us to actually implement. And I want us to communicate with as broad a variety of people as possible. If you do online politics, especially a couple of years ago, you all of a sudden encountered this group of twerps. I guess, hey, wait, does the civility principle not apply to the speaker? I'm just kidding. I love everybody. But I don't like everybody, but I try to love everybody, right? And they called themselves the intellectual dark web, this group of twerps. And what I noticed was that, one, it was a lot of hiding of the ball. Most of these things were just traditional conservative and I want to be really clear. When I say conservative, guys, I don't just mean Republican. I mean conservative. How many people are familiar with the New Republic in the 1990s? Not today. 1990s, 1980s New Republic? No reason you should be. That means you guys are all having great college lives, and I encourage that. But in the 1990s, the New Republic, and the 1980s, they used to say it was considered to be somewhat liberal, but the line that they would say was that it was even the New Republic was the joke. And that was because they always would find a way to either support Reagan administration foreign policy or demonize African Americans or wage a war on poor people. But it was always, I mean, look, we're not one of these conservatives. We're not like that. We're enlightened liberals. Here's why we have to do what all the conservatives want. And so the IDW struck me as very much in that vein. And so I did videos and I debunked and I had to listen to Sam Harris kind of drearily talk about Islam and Jordan Peterson has this. Yeah. For a guy who talks a lot about like traditional gender roles and whatnot, why does he sound like a 50s housewife? I mean, we're here, in Brooklyn being like, yeah, we're socialists who support transgender rights, but we're not crying every 2 seconds. So this is a little trying to present what happens on the show. So we did that content, and Dave Rubin was, I mean, come on, right? It's just, I almost feel bad at this point. He was just this kind of like, I don't know how many of you are familiar, I hope. Actually, how many people are generally familiar with these kinds of figures? Yeah. So it's really, you're lucky. So it's really sort of inundated in this environment. And Dave would just sort of stand, just sort of stare blankly into space. And, Sam Harris would be like, it's really, it's like Nazi Germany because blah, blah, blah. And he's just like, wow, it's like Nazi Germany, okay. And then people would come with you and they go, these ideas are so important. And what's interesting is in the process of writing this book, because you have to make it bigger than these people. Like this particular scene and act of self-branding is already almost over, and I didn't write the book in time for it to be in the zeitgeist that way. But the arguments that they're using, this is what you're going to see from every single right-wing movement in the future or center-right movement in the future that does not explicitly identify as nationalist or alt-right. The arguments that they're making about why capitalism just is, that's science, why we're not promoting racism or sexism, but we are very interested in some extremely antiquated ideas about scientific differences, quote unquote, right? So what you're seeing in these arguments, and I'm just going to bring in two other things because there's a lot to cover here and I can kind of get lost in the weeds. A basic difference, I would say, between left and right is the difference between historicizing and naturalizing. If you're on the left, broadly speaking, you look at things and you say, what are the historical, material reasons why that is happening? If you're on the right, you say that is what it is. Now, paradoxically, this is actually a reason why right now there's a lot of conflict between people who are more socialistic and people who are more like woke, quote unquote. Because their moral dimension is better. Look, America is a racist society is correct. Acknowledging that truth versus denying that truth is a major difference. No question. However, if you read Adolph Reed, who's one of my intellectual heroes, I really hope everybody is reading him, he will tell you why racism and white supremacy is a multi-generational project in America that depends on economic conditions, that manifests in different geographies, that is inseparable for how we produce and do capitalism. And actually, it might become separable, right? Whereas some people who have a woke discourse, it just is. It's the religious foundation of America. There's no difference between any different historical periods. It's just this moral block statement. Does that make sense? So some of these critiques can get really subtle, and that's actually what started to occur to me with the IDW and dealing with the right, because these guys were exploiting a lot of weaknesses. They were coming in and they were seeing people, you know, look, if your pop culture diet, and let's say you're an alienated young man, which is the primary audience for these guys, that's just market demographics. That's not a moral statement. I did some brand work. This is just like you're looking at your demos. You're alienated. You don't feel powerful. You probably have a lot of actually very valid complaints in your life. You flip open, say, some mediocre, bougie website that you think is the left, and what do you have? Seinfeld's actually problematic, and you suck, and shut the fuck up, and this is a problem, and that's a problem, and this is this, and that, da, 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 da. And then Jordan Peterson comes along and goes, no, actually, you're great, and you should have a government-provided wife to massage you. Now, and you didn't have people coming and saying, why? Why do you feel that you do? Right? So, because even in terms of relative privilege becomes in macro questions. Like in your personal behavior, yes, it's relevant. If you're walking around thinking you're the most victimized person in the world and you're not, it's obnoxious and it's problematic, sure. But in the big picture, nobody outside of an incredible, minute fraction of the population is doing better right now. Yes, you can talk about aggregate numbers and people have more washing machines and cell phones and blah, blah, blah. I know all of that. So please do save those questions and comments. Let's go more interesting. But inequality is rising. Alienation from the work you do is rising. Your ability to govern your own life is decreasing radically. And so you had people who were giving reactionary but constructive, proactive answers, and also empowering people's individual agency, which is funny as a socialist, I think is super important. We need a socialism that also has room for people's personal aspirations and ambitions and sense of making room for themselves in the world. We cannot make that wrong. And in fact, the only people that I really see making that wrong are usually very upper middle class bougie people. And I don't make that as like a moral comment. I'm talking like literally that's their position. They don't have to do that. I could tell you as someone, and I don't want to melodrama my own experience, but it's like, I know what it's like to be pretty broke at times and have like the heat turned off or whatever. So you understand why you might want to read some type of Horatio Alger narrative, right? So the IDW had answers, and the right had answers, and the left had the quote-unquote left, had a lot of moralism and condemnation, and not even that much nutrition. I think that is why, among many other things, including the really powerful social movements we have in the world today, and the very important ones on race and economic equity and so on, this is actually also why Bernie Sanders matters. Bernie Sanders is running a campaign that should be really basic and really obvious, but it's not, because we're not in basic and obvious. We are at a level of extreme, radical and systemic inequality. And that's also where we are in terms of our phase of capitalism. Like, yeah, with a more liberal approach, you could juice it a little bit. In fact, you could do a lot of what he's talking about. You can decommodify healthcare, you can make it a public good, you can say that the concentration of wealth cannot be this exactly extreme and ludicrous. But in the big picture, the room for new markets is shrinking. I mean, take away the morals of it. when we were going through the Industrial Revolution or the Consumer Goods Revolution, someone came along and said, hey, can you give me investment? Because I want, all of a sudden America's going to have a middle class, which was absolutely generated by government spending, let's be real, in the post-World War II. And I want, but I want to sell people dishwashers. Can I have some capital for it? Okay. And then millions of people will buy dishwashers. What phase of capitalism are we in now? WeWork was market value. SoftBank put billions of dollars into it's like a place where you commune, man. And that's partially because really there is a shrinking amount of untapped, primitive accumulation, right? So what you have in Bernie Sanders is someone who has an inkling of a recognition of that. And he, by going out and talking about your student loans and how you're objectively materially fucked, is doing more to de-radicalize people in that discourse about online than almost anybody else in the modern scene. I also think foreign policy is really important. And in him, I see the only candidate who's willing to speak somewhat clearly about the Middle East, somewhat clearly about India. He called for freeing President Lula, who people should really look up. He was an extraordinary president who led Brazil. He lifted 40 million people out of poverty. And he almost certainly would have been reelected president in 2018 if there was not an illegitimate process that put him in jail. He was recently freed because the prosecutorial team was humiliated. I'm always happy to talk about that. So, and I had the honor of interviewing him recently in Sao Paulo. So, that's it, guys. I'm ready to talk. I just wanted to give you a little bit of a sense of where I was coming from.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Great.
And thanks for having me. Thanks for having me.